Hi, I'm Kimberly Lapointe, and I'm a parishioner at St. Francis. And along with Father Michael, I'm co hosting this deep dive series into the model of spiral dynamics. So, if this is the first one that you're finding and on the topic of spiral dynamics, you're going to want to go back to the beginning and listen to Father Michael's first introduction and overview of kind of what spiral dynamics is and how we're going to lay out the material. If you know me at all from St. Francis, it might be as a participant in the podcast series around the conversations around COVID-19 and its impacts as we started to face those challenges in March. And as a scientist who sort of works in that biotech industry, and you might be wondering, how I got involved in something like spiral dynamics, because it's quite different. And the answer is it's kind of connected, because when I started to talk to Father Michael about sort of the facts, as I saw them as a scientist around COVID-19, we couldn't help but also talk about sort of the way that societies around the world and individuals within our own country and culture were responding to what was basically the same threat. It was a pathogen with the same set of facts, but the reactions and the responses and certainly the feelings about what we could and couldn't do to prevent the impact have been really different. And that was hard for me in the beginning. And I was searching for a certain understanding in the way that people were reacting and feeling resistant to advice, or what I saw as kind of empirical science advice. So that's what I'm biased to see it as. And Father Michael said to me, "What do you know about spiral dynamics?" And the answer was, well, nothing. And I'm really grateful to have gone on this journey and sort of learned about it. And I'm sort of feel like I'm only at the beginning. It's a pretty complicated and deep philosophy, but I spent quite a bit of time over the last month or so kind of digging into it. And I feel like I have such a better understanding for the ways in which we view the same set of facts and the same sort of threats and risks in our lives through different value systems. Maybe it's because we are different ages from each other, or we have different experiences, or we have different circumstances. So what I've learned is that the fundamentals of spiral dynamics say that you develop a set of values, a value system, or in the model of spiral dynamics, a color that is responding to life conditions that are defined as time, place, problems, and circumstance. As Father Michael went over in the first installment, you're sometimes moving through those as a society or a culture, and then at the same time sort of progressing through those stages as an individual. And so understanding this better has really let me understand how people can be having different feelings, different priorities, different risk assessments, even while stating the same facts, because they are in different life conditions and life circumstances, either personally or as a society. And so you can look around the world in the response to something as challenging as COVID-19 and see how different societies had big pros or cons for how to sort of implement control or response to such a global challenge. So for me, it's been tremendously useful, and I hope it will be for you too. The goal of this session is to kind of give a second introduction. The first introduction that Father Michael went over, I hope that you got to listen to it, was sort of an overview of the different colors, which is how the value systems are defined within spiral dynamics. And sort of the very, very basic overview of the characteristics of those and kind of the history of the model and the founders and how it has built and on itself as a model that's been kind of integrated into solving a lot of complex global problems since then. The purpose of today, though, is to focus on sort of how those colors relate to each other, how the spiral is structured, and the movement between the spiral and the way that we sort of view or value them as a hierarchy in some ways, but also as stages that you need to absorb as you move from one to the other. So one of the things that I was quite sensitive to when I first read this, and you read the book that Father Michael referred to, which is the sort of fundamental textbook around spiral dynamics, is that when you're first starting, it can really feel like the message is that you're moving through this spiral and that you're getting to places, you're getting to colors that are better than the one before it, that are more evolved or more, valued than the one before it. And that's not really exactly true. I mean, in some ways, yes, the goal is to move through the spiral and reach the second tier. And so the colors that Father Michael talked in depth about, the beige all the way up through green, are tier 1, as it's described in spiral dynamics, and they are value systems that are quite rigid, and you move between them, and that the goal is to get sort of beyond all that to an integrated view where you take all of the best from all of the stages and you recognize that you have to be flexible to move between those value systems and to have absorbed the best parts of them. So I think one thing that we both want to be really sensitive to is that as we deep dive into the colors of spiral dynamics, we're all going to, the model states that we're all going to feel that we have a dominant identity within one of those colors. And we want to be careful to not say that the message of the model is that you're trying to, or that you have to move beyond that into something better. That's not at all what the model suggests. The model suggests that life circumstances change, and that as life becomes more complex, or the society becomes more complex and integrated and diverse, that you will move through these stages sort of naturally in a response to those changing circumstances, whatever they are in your life or in the life of the society. And that in order to get to that tier 2, where you're able to be a real systems thinker, that 1% that can integrate and respond, that you've absorbed the best parts of each stage, and that you have to go through them all, and that you can't skip them, and that each color contributes something really valuable. So the principles addressed in the book in a chapter called The Mind of the Spiral are these important principles, which are that every value system, every color is very important. It has a place, and it has a place in your own personal development and in the society's development. It's not inherently better or worse. In fact, originally when Clare Graves developed the system, he assigned letters, an A through Z system, so the colors didn't yet exist. And then it went through a short period of time where there was actually numbers. And then in the 70s, when the model sort of evolved with the next architects, they came up with this color system. And the reason that they did was because they kept coming back to the fact that if they left it as letters or numbers, they weren't going to be able to undo the bias that the higher number or that the more advanced letter was better or worse than the ones before it. And they really did want to erase that sort of bias and impose the idea that no, a color isn't better or worse, it is just where you are. The value systems are in a hierarchy or a spiral as you go up the spiral, but the hierarchy, as I said, more specifically deals with the increased complexity of life conditions. And so when you start in the beige, which we probably won't spend a ton of time on because it's not something that relatably exists a lot in the world today, but it's very primal, very survivalist. And then you move up to the further stages that Father Michael talked about, where you establish, a collective cooperation, and then government systems, and then personal ambition and innovation, and then a sense of justice and egalitarianism, and all of these things that you're moving through. They're really responses to complexity caused by the color before it. And so this is something that I really want to get across today, that when we dive into these colors in a deep way, when we do a podcast that is dedicated wholly to one color, we'll talk in depth about the characteristics and the values within that color, but also the triggers. And so some real world examples of what stresses that come from the color before or from an outside external force can sort of, start to introduce the idea of the next color or those feelings. They are responsive. Every value system, every color have healthy and unhealthy manifestations. So if you've been fortunate enough to do the Enneagram study with Father Michael in the past, you'll recognize that sort of idea that, there isn't one Enneagram type that's better than another, and that there's healthy and unhealthy manifestations of each, and spiral dynamics is very much the same way, where each color has pros and has value and has something good that comes from it. But when goes unchecked, can really cause an unhealthy manifestation. And then, so, again, there's an unhealthy way to be all of these things. The goal, according to the spiral dynamics model, is that as you move from one color to the next, as you start to deal with increasing levels of complexity, as you start to solve problems or react to things in the color that you're in currently, and you start to sort of get the introduction of the next color, the goal is not to reject the one before it, but rather to integrate that, to absorb it, and then to transcend into the next color. And so sometimes, people can ricochet up and down the hierarchy between colors or ping pong back and forth because they're very reactive and they can sort of go back and forth. But the idea, if you really want to reach that tier 2 yellow, the goal is to integrate and to transcend into the next color, and to sort of take what really works from that value system and then move on to the next. And so, like I said, we'll kind of get into some of the specific triggers that can move you from one color to the next. The analogy that I really like here from the book is that it's kind of like the rings of a tree. When you cut down that tree and you see the rings that we think of as the age of the tree and the growth of the tree, ideally you are forming this strength as you go, certainly through the individual colors as an individual growing up, and you kind of go through those primal stages as a very young child, and you move up, you're adding the rings that are making you a stronger and stronger tree because you've absorbed the best parts, the most secure and safe parts of those primal ones, and then the structure and the order and the discipline, and so on and so forth, as you get out to a stronger and stronger tree. So that really helped me think about it as an integration and transcendence into the next color, rather than a rejection and a learning and that was no good and I'm moving on to the next better thing. So that said, you don't sort of like a light switch move cleanly from one color to the next, and neither do societies. Society is even less so. So dealing with the individual first, you start to experience the challenges of the color that you're in. And the way that it's described in the model is that these colors and these value systems sort of come into your life like waves, like overlapping waves. So whether you think about them as sort of a sign chart like I do, or whether you think of them as like sort of ocean waves, the challenges that frustrate you about the color that you're in, or the external set of circumstances that make the color that you're in limiting, whatever the case may be, start to rise like a wave. And then when that wave gets to a crest, it's kind of when you're open to the exit of the color that you were in. And as the wave crashes down, that new color becomes your more dominant way of thinking. So if you're thinking about just a clean linear move through the hierarchy of spiral dynamics, and from beige to purple to red, etc., you're thinking of it as this wave. And so at any given time, you're in a minimum often of 2 colors. You sort of have the 1 foot in one color and 1 foot in the other. And sometimes the model will describe it as your entrance into, let's say you're moving from blue to orange. Then you sort of have the entry point where you have a foot in blue and a foot in orange, and then you have this sort of orange time, and then you have a foot in orange and a foot in green. And so as you're entering orange and you're exiting orange, you sort of have a foot in these other two value systems on either side. On top of that, particularly when it comes to the individual, again, when you think about the colors coming as a response to life circumstances and life conditions, you can get, and you do get, a system where most of us are, if you think, and there's another analogy in the book that I found very useful, that if you slice an onion now, sort of think of those same rings, except that now, instead of like the tree where they're basically, you know, concentric and the same size, when you think of the onion, you have they're sort of asymmetrical, and you have, you know, larger sections of that circle around the onion. And so this gives way to a concept in spiral dynamics called stacks. And so you can have color or value stacks, where within your own life, you can have different dominant value systems, different dominant colors in different areas of your life. And so we all know people, or maybe you are a person that people often remark, they're so different at work than they are at home. And so that's because the life conditions, the challenges, and the experience are different. You're maybe at different stages of development in those two silos of your life, politics and religion and all of these other places that we move through in our lives. We are perhaps in different colors in those areas. But what the model says is that we all sort of have a dominant color that we identify with, or, you know, those two colors that we sort of identify with being in the transition period between, or really weighing, or the two that we dominantly see in our lives, if it's work and home, etc. So I think that's really helpful to understand too, especially as we look at how we value the colors. If your experience is like mine, you're going to have sort of a dominant identity in one, and you're going to have the easiest time sort of sympathizing and empathizing with the values within that one color. But it doesn't mean that it's everything that you are. You're most like, if you're like most of us, you probably have one of those stacks, and you feel and react and have different values and are in experiencing different colors in different parts of your life. So in terms of the organization of the colors too, you know, Father Michael went over kind of the basic characteristics of the individual colors, but there are some sort of kind of neat things about the way that the colors are organized that are helpful for you remembering kind of what's what and how we are triggered to move from one to the next. And so Father Michael talked a little bit about how the colors themselves don't really have a meaning. They're somewhat arbitrary in the sense that they're a memory device to help you, you know, kind of remember the sequence of the spiral dynamics model, but that there is sort of a little bit of memory device that's been applied to the colors after the fact. So they are, the very first one is beige. That's that very basic survivalist one that Father Michael described. And so the association there to help you remember what beige is the savanna and the grasslands. And so the idea of sort of a very early tribal, in fact, almost pre-tribal existence on the savanna. Purple is that magical stage that Father Michael said, where we start to, for the first time, kind of integrate with each other and assign meaning to things. And so purple is kind of a royal color assigned to chiefs and monarchs. And so it's the first time that we try to band together. Red is a very hot, emotional color. So red is the quite impulsive color. And it's that hot-blooded emotion, the fire. Father Michael talked about it being sort of the teenage phase in our individual. So if you have teenagers, probably the red memory device really speaks to you. And then blue, which is that very purposeful kind of order, law and order type color and value system. The memory device for that is that you're sort of a true blue believer, or, sky blue or true blue, or, we often associate blue as the fact, the true blue fact. Then orange, which is that achievist, that scientist, that unbridled sort of ambition and innovation, type 1. The memory device there is the radiating furnace of the industrial age. And so, when we really move towards more industrial and innovation things, so that hot ember that we sort of associate with that. Green, which is that egalitarian kind of very justice-seeking color, that's probably a pretty easy one for most of us because we associate it with kind of ecological concerns and what we sort of even openly describe as green politics in the US culture, at least right now. And then yellow, which is, again, that only place in tier 2 that we're really going to talk about in this series, that integrated way of thinking. The association, the memory device there is, solar energy or alternative technologies, because, you can sort of see how that analogy of solar energy has integrated a more, sort of orange technology with an ecological mindedness, and other systems that would have, and disciplines that would have been developed along the way. So alternative energies and solar is the yellow memory device. I'm gonna end by just talking really broadly about kind of those frustrations and triggers that can lead to the movement to the next stage, and then just kind of a couple of those definitions. I know we will get into sure very specific examples kind of throughout history and individually when we digest each of the colors in our next series. But I just wanted to start you thinking about, kind of, again, that wave model and the types of frustrations that can start to build you up and start you thinking about the next color. And, I think ultimately the goal of this series, if you got to hear Father Michael's sermon on Sunday, is to help us, be self-aware about sort of where our values come from and the experiences that shaped it, which is always really helpful in our lives and in our Christian lives, but then ultimately to relate to each other better, which is what I've definitely gotten out of this study so far. So when we start at that beginning, the survivalist, when we move from beige to purple, there's a really utilitarian trigger for that, which is just that, the discovery that surviving works better when you work together with other people. And so in the societal, when we banded together, there was strength in numbers and we were able to achieve more. And then in the individual, when you're a child, you obviously recognize pretty quickly that you're reliant on others. And so you start to look to an authority in that purple phase. So that's the trigger there. When we move from purple to red, we've achieved some basic sense of safety. And so we aren't all day, every day, all of our time is focused on what keeps us safe. And so it frees up some energy and we move towards a personal ambition. I'm going to stop here for just a second because I realized that I forgot a really important way that the colors are organized. And that's that basically they alternate between very individual value systems and colors and collective. And again, a memory device that really helps and is part of the way that the colors are assigned is that the warm colors, beige, red, and orange, are the individual, the very I value colors, and that the cooler palette, hopefully you're all home decorators and just can think really quickly about what the cool palette is. But the purple, the blue, and the green are the we and the communal ideas. And so coming back to where I was just talking about those kind of broad triggers, you go from the individual survival to recognizing you survive better as a collective. Then you've achieved some safety and you kind of you know, start to get that little sense of self again, and you start to have a power ambition yourself, and you sort of take what you want, you take all the resources, and you want power and you want to rule, and that's what pushes us into that red. And then the red kind of exhausts itself, you know. There is this chaos and real injustice to it that causes obviously a lot of problems and frustration, and gives way to blue, which is where we introduce, in the societal way, government and structures and authoritarian systems and things like that. And in the individual piece, a sense of discipline and principles, and you know, religion often, and things that bring structure and order to your life, because the red is too chaotic to be sustainable. It's just exhausting. And then what would trigger the next is that with that sort of authoritarian and law and order and structure, on the societal piece, you get enough organization to have a money system that sort of leads to, again, an individual maybe greed or ambition, or an incentive structure for invention and innovation. And in the personal, again, you sort of rebel maybe against that sense of sacrifice that is in blue. You know, blue is very much sacrificing for the collective good, and being in service to others. And so maybe you start to resist that a little bit, and you just want to kind of strike out on your own. And so this is, Father Michael made the comment that we have a lot of orange in the US, and it's kind of the driver behind like a capitalist idea, and a free market, and that very unbridled success story that we value in American culture so much. But as he also said, you then you exhaust those resources, and that gets a little bit unchecked and unbridled, and then gives way to the thinking of, well, you know, maybe it causes big income disparities, and it causes environmental stress, of course, and then that gives way to a greener way of thinking, and thinking, well, you know, maybe there's a way to be more egalitarian, and we start to see a move away from a meritocracy more towards, you know, an equal sharing of resources. And then ultimately, green becomes quite frustrated, that, and in the best case scenario, gives way to yellow, in a person who has taken all the learnings, all the discipline, all the ambition, all the innovation, and all the sort of sense of justice, and integrated that into a way of thinking that is, that we can't solve all the world's problems in a green mentality, because you're never going to solve these very complex problems. Because remember that in every color, the idea is that what you're dealing with is becoming more complex, and we're never going to do that through complete consensus. And so the idea that you need a more systematic way of thinking, and a more agile way of responding to changing conditions, in order to solve those more complex problems. So I'm going to stop there, because I could keep talking and talking and talking, and I don't want to give away too much of the individual deep dives into the colors. But basically, you know, I think the real takeaway from this session is the understanding that you don't have to, in order to be a healthy, happy, contributing, fulfilled, actualized person, move through this trajectory. You can stay in one color where you are comfortable, and work towards being the healthiest version of that, and that every color within a society contributes something really important. But that we are moving, sort of, whether we like it or not, through this sort of hierarchy of colors, and that we can move in either direction. And again, it's not positive or negative, but we continue to change in response to life conditions. And so that was the big piece that I think we wanted to attack here, as well as those kind of basic memory devices that I hope help you keep an overwhelming amount of information around the colors straight in your head. Warmer colors being the I, and cooler colors being the we, and that those go back and forth. And then, also those sort of symbolic word associations with the colors that maybe help keep them a little bit straighter. And then also the concept of a color stack or a value stack, which is that most of us, while we might have a dominant color that we identify with, we're probably a more asymmetric collection of colors in the different areas of our lives that have different life conditions. So I hope that helps set the stage to start digging into the colors, and I hope you'll join us for the discussion about this piece and movement in the spiral, where I'll be aided by Father Michael, who's a much better authority on this topic. So I hope to see a lot of you there for that discussion and to keep talking to you throughout the study. So thanks.